Good evening to you all. I'm Graham Walker, and I want to welcome you to this event honoring the late David J. Theroux and the legacy and future of liberty. It is my privilege to welcome you on behalf of the Theroux family, many of whose members are here, and also on behalf of the Independent Institute and of the C.S. Lewis Society of California. These are remarkable organizations which embody David's vision for human worth and dignity. Thank you all for coming, especially those of you who may have endured some pretty difficult traveling conditions over the last couple of days, and we're so glad you made it. And second, we are delighted to have with us this evening the Most Reverend Salvatore Cordileone, Archbishop of San Francisco. Welcome, Your Excellency. And would you be so kind, Your Excellency, as to join me up here to offer an invocation and blessing on our event and on our meal?
Let us bow our heads to pray. Good and gracious God, you taught us through your apostle Paul that it is for freedom that your Son, Jesus Christ, came to set us free. We give you thanks for the opportunity to come together this evening to honor and celebrate a great champion of freedom, your servant and son, David Theroux. We ask you to grant him the reward of the just and welcome him into your kingdom. As we ask you as well for your Spirit's gift of wisdom and understanding, that we might grasp what he taught us with his life and appropriate it into our own lives. Grant us the Spirit's gift of piety and reverence for you, that we might recognize your image in the other, especially the poor, the suffering, the needy in any way. Grant us the Spirit's gifts of knowledge and of fortitude, that we might know your will and be strengthened to carry it out, that we might proclaim your goodness and truth to the world and share your love, that the world might be healed and united. Grant us grateful hearts for the gifts of food, drink, and fellowship we receive this evening. Open our minds and hearts to the word you wish to speak to us tonight. Bless these gifts. Bless especially those who go without food today. And at the end of our earthly pilgrimage, O Lord, we ask that you might join us to the eternal banquet of your kingdom, where no one goes hungry, but all are satisfied with the vision of your glory forever and ever. Amen. Bon appetit.
We have a couple of people who wanted to say something short. Benjamin Powell has been a long-time research fellow with us, and he was with us in Oakland for many years, and now heads up a group at Texas Tech. Pardon me. We're so delighted that you would be here with us, Ben. And then following Ben, our son Paul.
Mary, thank you so much. It's a great honor that you asked me to say a few remarks about our relationship with David and him with scholarship at this event. So David hired me almost 20 years ago to run the Center for Entrepreneurial Innovation at the Independent Institute, when at that time I was a young assistant professor at San Jose State University. I worked with him and the rest of the team in Oakland a couple days a week throughout the rest of my time in California. And as I moved on to other universities, I continued to have an affiliation with the Independent Institute and work with David in various capacities over these last nearly 20 years. David was a great intellectual entrepreneur who had a knack for getting scholars to contribute more to advancing the ideas of liberty than the scholars themselves thought that they had the ability, and for that matter, sometimes the will to do themselves. There are many scholars in this room who I'm sure David pushed to complete work that they might not otherwise have undertaken. Personally, I'm grateful for the ways that David pushed me to grow as both a scholar and a public intellectual early in my career. He pushed me to always say yes to invitations to do interviews on television. When I'd hesitate because the topic wasn't in my wheelhouse, David would say something along the lines of, "But Ben, they're going to interview somebody, and whoever they ask next isn't going to make as good a case for a freer society as you." Because of David, I began imagining what quote the TV interviewer would use from a random professor at Berkeley when they replaced me. It became easy to say yes to TV interview requests on things I knew very little about. David also made my first book, Making Poor Nations Rich, much better than I originally conceived of the project. My initial proposal focused on countries that I had friends who had done research on and that I was sure would say yes when I invited. David instead said, which are the countries that are most interesting to study for the point you want to make, and who are the best people who do work on them, and let's invite them to do this project. I was skeptical I would be able to secure some of the right authors for this, but David was confident, despite giving me essentially no budget to incentivize them with. But he was right. Almost everybody I invited said yes, and in a couple of cases, David had to use his persuasive powers to get the reluctant on board. If it was like the times that David used these persuasive powers on me, it went something like this. The phone would ring unannounced, and if I did not answer, the voice message would simply say, "Hi, Ben, this is David Theroux. Please call me back at," and then he would say his number and give me no hint at all of what it was that he wanted me to do until I was actually on the line live with him, and we would continue to talk until I was convinced that the right thing to do would be whatever it was that David was cooking up at the time. Now, he also gave that book, Making Poor Nations Rich, its title. I myself had a different title for the book that was a little bit less marketing friendly, called Entrepreneurship in the Process of Development. First time I saw the change of title was once David had already marked up a copy of the new cover, and I was a little bit perturbed. But after a bit of conversation, he convinced me he was right, and he definitely was. It made the book better. And amusingly, during the cocktail reception, I ran into Alex Tabarrok, who told me essentially the same story for Entrepreneurial Economics, a book that he did with him a few years prior to that project. So I am far from alone in people whose books David has improved. In fact, inspiring, improving, and promoting books was one of David's greatest talents. The Independent Institute published more than 140 books under David's leadership. Many of them were path-breaking. The style of most independent books reflects David's own qualities. They are scholarly, principled in their deep dedication to advancing liberty, and simultaneously don't confine themselves to mere academic theorizing, but offer positive paths forward to advancing a more efficient, freer, and just society. I'll conclude by saying that there is no think tank president that I would be more proud to have worked with over the last 19 years. David was a courageous and consistent voice for liberty. On the big issues during tough times, and I'm thinking in particular about immediately post 9/11 and during COVID, the Independent Institute never wavered in its commitment to individual liberty, and that is primarily due to David Theroux's leadership. It was an honor and a pleasure to work with David, and I'm a better scholar and public intellectual as a result, and I'm sure there's other people in this room and around the globe who could say the same thing. Thank you, David.
Hello, I'm Paul Theroux, David's oldest son. I started working at the Independent Institute about 20 years ago, once I graduated from UC Berkeley. At first doing low-level tasks like data entry, and later taking on more responsibility and getting promoted to the role of technology director. I work closely with my dad on many projects, such as designing new websites and web pages and building data analysis tools for organizing our mailing list and tracking sales and donors and that sort of thing. I always enjoyed being able to pop into his office throughout the day to share projects I was working on and seeing his face light up when he approved of what I was working on. Since he's been gone, I've continued to work at the Institute, and for any work I've done, I've tried to imagine the positive reaction he'd have to what I was working on. Even when I was off work, he'd often call me day or night with random technical support issues like how to organize his Firefox bookmarks, how to convert and open many of the thousands of 30-year-old Microsoft Word documents he still had on his computer, how to turn off the flashlight on his iPhone. And I never minded because I always liked to hear from him. When he'd introduce me to people, he would always tell them I was his technology miracle worker, quote unquote, which I found embarrassing because I thought he was trying to make me feel important. But looking back, now I realize he sincerely meant it. As my dad got older, he became more sentimental and idealistic. I would say he always put a positive spin on every situation. Everything always had a silver lining. For example, if he ever got sick with a cold, he would never say he had a cold. He would always say he was getting over a cold. Another example, when my wife Charlize didn't pass her CPA exam the first time, his reaction was, well, just think how much you'll learn by studying all the material again a second time, and how much an expert you'll be. At Independent, he channeled this optimistic philosophy into all of his work. Whenever the government did anything wrong, he, rather than despair that the country or California was going down the tubes, he would see it as a teachable moment and an opportunity to turn the bad situation into a project, like a book or a policy report or a video series. One of the things Mary would always say and marvel at was his ability, as she put it, to create something out of nothing, where he would decide that some project needed to be done to make an impact on an issue like healthcare or higher education. So we'd find a scholar to write a book on that issue and find donors to fund the project and just make it happen through sheer will. Every time he saw a problem, he'd work to fix it or build a team of people to fix it. My work with him always felt like it was building towards something, and although he's no longer with us, I know that his spirit will live on in everything we do, and I look forward to doing what I can to continue his legacy.
I know you're all having really interesting conversations, and we're trying to break this up so that you have time for those conversations. But we also have other people after me. So thank you again all so much for being here. It means such a lot, and just delighted to share this evening together. And I'm delighted to get to share a little bit about David's life. As I think most of you knew, David was very remarkable, and he was truly a man who lived with purpose, passion, and joy, which is a wonderful combination. I've never known anybody who got so much out of life. He noticed everything around him. He took delight in the tiniest details of everything. And when you meet people, he just deeply engaged with them on a deep level. So David was born in East Lansing, Michigan in 1949. But within a few weeks, his parents moved to Boston, which set the pattern for a life of a lot of moves when he was growing up. His mother had been a kindergarten teacher, and she was very involved in the raising and education of her children, instilling strong foundational beliefs in God and country. A Goldwater conservative, she gave David a copy of his Conscience of a Conservative when he was a teenager. With the dedication he would show throughout his life, David attained Eagle Scout and later won a commission to the Air Force Academy, entering at the height of the Vietnam War. Among the training at the academy were war games that included imprisonment in a North Vietnamese POW camp. And as other famous prison experiments have shown, despite on some level knowing that the prison wasn't real, despite all that, nearly every cadet signed the forced confession. David was a rare exception to that. But while he still believed in America's founding principles, he increasingly recognized that the means of the war were at odds with the advancing of those principles. And so at the end of his third year, he resigned from the academy. He owed the Air Force 2 years of service at that point and didn't want to go to Vietnam. So he requested and was posted to a little desired Air Force base in Shreveport, Louisiana. Now he was surrounded, he'd gone from being the elite of the elite at the academy to being surrounded by enlistees with very little education. So he ended up spending most of his time in the base library. And one day there he discovered a thin book with an essay in it by Friedrich Hayek titled, "Why I Am Not a Conservative." In it he found echoes of his mother's teaching of the danger of government power, but beyond, Hayek criticized conservatives who sought to use government power in other ways. Intrigued, David then ordered the books that Hayek had referenced in that essay, and then he read those, and he ordered the books that were referenced in those, and then he ordered more, till pretty soon he had a whole library that he was reading through on economics, history, law, political theory, and everything. With his obligation to the Air Force complete, David entered Berkeley to continue studying math and engineering. He later wrote of this formative period of his life, quote, "When I arrived at Berkeley, I was in for a rude awakening as I was unprepared for the depth and pervasive influence of the new left on campus and among students. I was confronted not just with the contradictions I had faced regarding the war, but moreover the idea that people had rights and were not just materialistic lumps of protoplasm for use for a future socialist state. A climax of this issue came one day when I asked the leader of the Communist Spartacist League what they wanted to do in addition to ending the Vietnam War. He stated clearly that everyone would be rounded up, placed in uniform, and sent to re-education camps for assignment to jobs determined by the new American-Soviet committees. Freedom was an illusion. Individuals did not have rights, and reason and science were tools of oppression and had to be restructured by the party. All private possessions would be confiscated, the university closed, and a new age of socialism would dawn. I realized that there was a deep problem here, not only in the student, but in the wider culture. Just by chance, I was invited to attend a conference at Stanford on liberty with a scholarship that included books. One of the books was C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. Since it was short, I read it quickly beforehand, shocked by what he said. He, in effect, answered what I was being confronted with at Berkeley and more broadly. Man was not a number nor a cog in a machine. We were all independent individuals with rights and souls. His book was a frontal attack on modernism and naturalism, including the vulgar Marxism I confronted daily at Berkeley. When I returned from the conference, I went to the bookstore to see if they had any other books by Lewis, and I found Mere Christianity. And again, I was surprised and intrigued by what he said. I did not at first agree with everything he said, but I did agree with most of it, and it gave me a new framework to argue with Marxists and others at Berkeley who sought to imprison us all in a mindless camp of 1984, end quote. Lewis also helped David to see, quote, for the first time, that a seamless web existed to understand even more what had confronted man in the 20th century. The Vietnam War was not just the result of a bunch of liberals and conservatives seeking to draft men and drop bombs, all in the name of democracy, but was the result of a profound failure in the world of ideas, end quote. His foundation was thus truly set for his career ahead. Because the Air Force Academy went year-round, he entered Berkeley with so many credits that after 1 year, he was able to graduate with 2 degrees in math and engineering, and a year later, a master's. Following Berkeley, he worked as a petroleum engineer in Texas and Louisiana, continuing his self-directed scholarship in Liberty. He also became familiar with FEE and IHS and developed a personal correspondence and friendship with their founders, Leonard Read and Baldy Harper, as well as many of the scholars affiliated with each. In 1975, Roger McBride invited him to his first Mont Pelerin meeting, held at Hillsdale and devoted to Hayek, who had won the Nobel the previous year. There he met Milton Friedman and many others. At the time, he was considering where to go to graduate school, and Friedman urged him to apply to Chicago, which he did, and he was accepted. Now, David's time in Shreveport hadn't all been a wasteland. He had met Elaine Shipp there, and they married in 1976, just before he entered Chicago's PhD program in economics. At Chicago, David organized a visiting lecture series in Austrian economics at the business school, including lectures given by Kerzner, Rothbard, and others, and culminating in 2 talks by Hayek. While still at Chicago, he was approached about joining a new institute being formed in San Francisco called Cato. He consulted with his advisor, Yale Brosen, who encouraged him to pursue the opportunity. He'd gone far enough that he could leave with an MBA, and he could always return to finish his PhD. At the new Cato Institute, David organized its academic program, including a network of graduate students and faculty called Cato Associates, as well as summer seminars in political economy, a speakers program, and the publications Cato's Papers, Policy Report, and Cato's Letter, and an essay contest later taken over by Fee. Cato later moved to DC, and David was hired to head up a new policy organization being founded by Anthony Fisher, and that David renamed the Pacific Institute, later PRI. At Pacific, David produced 30 book projects, as well as national honorary dinners for luminaries including Milton Friedman and Hayek. When I woke up this morning without a voice, I just had to laugh because every major event that we ever did had an 11th hour something. In the case of the Hayek dinner, Hayek had been traveling in Japan and became ill, and his doctor told him he couldn't travel. So David had an event in a couple of weeks with sold-out ballroom and no Hayek. Fortunately, he got Thomas Sowell to agree to speak on the importance of Hayek's work, and he arranged a telephone hookup from Japan for Hayek to speak to the group, which in those days was... So when he rather nervously went to flip the switch for Hayek to come on over the loudspeaker, he was very relieved when it worked. While he was at Pacific, David also organized the conference on federal rangeland policy. My family had a cattle ranch in Nevada, and that's how my dad became aware of his work. So when my parents were visiting me here in San Francisco, Dad one day said, "Take me by this place. I want to meet this David Theroux." So my mother and I sat in the room while they were conversing, and I was so excited. I had no idea such an organization existed, and I was absolutely thrilled. Growing up, we had been given constant lessons from my dad on the tenets of liberty, and my mother had co-founded the Wichita Collegiate School, where our high school curriculum included Bastiat, Rosewater Lane, Hayek, Friedman, and others. Plus, we had summer seminars, this may not mean something to many of you, but it does to others, with Bob Lefebvre of the Freedom School. It was 1986. David finally realized his dream of heading up his own policy organization, one that would adhere to the highest standards of independent scholarly inquiry, when he and Bruce Johnson left Pacific and founded Independent. At the time, I was running a company called Grocery Express, and David would come and use my offices, and I was also a founding board member of his. However, Reagan was in the White House. As David went around looking for funding, he'd frequently be told, "We've won the battle of ideas. It's time to govern. We don't need more think tanks." So he was forced to bootstrap Independent with his typical entrepreneurial approach. David had operated several book services during his time as a student and afterwards, so he taught himself the direct mail catalog business in earnest, creating the Liberty Tree Review and Catalog, offering products for your life, liberty, and prosperity. He pioneered several innovations, including co-binding and mailing Liberty Tree with a gardening catalog to achieve economies of scale in printing and postage costs, and first in the industry, selling advertising in a catalog. My experience in grocery fulfillment was helpful in setting up Liberty Tree's back end, and I soon also found myself helping out in ways I never could have imagined, including selling advertising and learning desktop publishing. Well, eventually the economics of direct mail deteriorated, but by that time, Independent's program was in full swing with a strong donor base to support it. As many of the tributes in the program highlight, and as Ben talked about, David produced scores of award-winning publications, from 1987's Crisis in Leviathan to engaging Jordan Peterson to provide the foreword to our forthcoming book, The Night Before His Fatal Seizure. In addition to our own work, David also supported others' efforts in Liberty, including the Chinese dissidents, for which David was presented a replica of the Goddess of Liberty from Tiananmen Square. As Ben and many have noted, the next great watershed, of course, was 9/11. While we shared the horror of the world around the events of the day, because of David's deep studies, he immediately grasped the far greater danger looming of the governments exploiting the attacks to grow in ways never before seen and deprive Americans of even more of our liberties and privacy. David insisted we post their statement on the terrorist attacks, warning against such power grabs. In the days following, we issued calls for the issuance of constitutionally provided letters of marque and reprisal to bring those behind the attacks to justice, and we launched an extensive program on peace and liberty. But the greatest shock about 9/11 to David was seeing the widespread embrace of calls for war and violent reprisals by many he had thought shared his belief in the universal sanctity of human life, dignity, and liberty. And it seared his soul. I think most today agreed that the responses to 9/11 were mistaken. At the time, taking a stand as David did came at a high cost. I had to laugh at the beginning of the tribute in your programs from Alberto Mingardi, where he says, quote, "He had the reputation of a difficult person." And in instances as this, he certainly was. David didn't compromise. He didn't go along to get along, and no matter what it cost him in anything. He knew what was enduring, good, and true, and stuck to it. Now confronted with a deep need to push back against the new culture, David did as he always did and turned to study, this time delving deeper into the roots of natural law and the literature of those such as the Christian scholastics, which formed the basis for the subsequent Austrian School of Economics. Seeking to reestablish the link between Christian moral truths and liberty, David established the C.S. Lewis Society, both to make Christians aware of the liberty-affirming political and economic implications of Christ's teachings and to introduce secular libertarians and free marketeers to their Christian roots. When we married in 1991, David brought to the marriage his delightful sons, and I felt my life was well and truly complete. The subsequent years were full of adventures and an ever-deepening understanding of life and love's many mysteries. We were pretty nearly always taking on new challenges, and there was truly never a dull day with David. But as important as his work was to him, David loved engaging with others and was especially focused on supporting others in their growth over promoting himself. For years, we hosted summer seminars for students, and we would usually have a house full of them staying with us. David would spend hours talking with those who wanted to discuss any and everything. And similarly with our fellows, some of who you might recognize, he was always offering suggestions, references from his vast reading, and encouragement to them, and devoted himself tirelessly to advancing their work and profiles. There are countless whose careers he touched, as Ben discussed earlier, and advanced in significant and important ways, from gestures such as giving a recent college graduate whose wardrobe hadn't progressed past college casual a copy of Dress for Success, out of print but timeless, through promoting fellows and their books widely across the media and academia. Above all, David loved his family. I was never in doubt about his feelings for me because he told me every day. He always wanted his sons and later his extended family around him. We wanted the boys to know the world beyond the Bay Area as they were growing up, and we traveled extensively both at home and globally. David was a master of finding ways of keeping the boys interested in yet another museum or cathedral, and we always had to carry an extra suitcase for all the books we picked up along the way. David loved Christmas and filled our living room to overflowing with gifts ranging from cheap novelties to wildly extravagant. He delighted in his train that ran around the tree, especially in most recent years when our grandchildren, Jennifer and Patrick, could play it with him. David retained a childlike delight and sense of fun throughout his life. Whenever he'd hang a spoon from his nose, which was more often than you'd think, taunt us at the dinner table with his extending fork, play Mr. Hand with Jennifer, or squirt us all in the swimming pool with water guns. You never peg him as a great intellectual leader. I will remember David on the floor with the grandchildren, a child himself, laughing and playing happily for hours. He knew joy, and he certainly knew how to spread it. Thank you.
George Gilder is with us. He is, of course, a senior fellow here. He's a senior fellow at the Discovery Institute and has been a founding member from the beginning of the Board of Advisors for the Independent Institute. We're very grateful, George, for your standing with David Theroux for those many years of good advice and input. George Gilder is probably known to most of the people in this room. He has a pretty remarkable career. I can only give you a few little tidbits of it because it's too interesting. He studied at Harvard under Henry Kissinger. Later, he was a speechwriter for a number of prominent candidates for president, including Nelson Rockefeller, George Romney, and Richard Nixon. Later, he also consulted with many leaders in technology and became a noted futurist. He caught the attention of Ronald Reagan, and according to a study of presidential speeches, Mr. Gilder was President Reagan's most frequently quoted living author. How about that? That's quite an achievement. He's the author of many books, notably the 1986 book, The Spirit of Enterprise, which gained a lot of attention, and rightly so. I first became acquainted with George Gilder's work in the early 80s because of his works on men and marriage and wealth and poverty, two really fabulous titles that are worth reading even now. George Gilder was prescient about social trends even back then, and I'm grateful for his input. As I say, in recent years, he's become quite an expert on future trend prognostication, especially in high technology areas, as a futurist. He wrote two especially interesting recent books called Life After Google, and another one called, much worth reading, another one called Gaming AI, Why AI Can't Think But Can Transform Jobs. In fact, on the Independent Institute website, there's an interview that George graciously did with me on that book. Really interesting. Another book, Life After Capitalism. Oh boy, what could that mean? You can read George Gilder's work also in The Economist, the Harvard Business Review, Wall Street Journal, many publications. George, it is an honor to have you be associated with the Independent Institute. Please come and talk to us about the future of liberty.
Thank you, Graham. It is just a tremendous honor to be here and representing in some way David, who has had a kind of parallel career with me throughout, from the time I helped start the Manhattan Institute with Anthony Fisher, and he was starting the Pacific Institute with Anthony Fisher. We both were exponents of Hayek, and Hayek was a favorite of my father's, my father died in the Second World War, and but he managed to persuade David Rockefeller to abandon business school and go to London School of Economics to study with Hayek. So we've just have all kinds of common interests and convergent beliefs, and they all can sort of be summed up with the proposition, in the beginning was the Word. Now, this is a crucial religious thesis, but it also is the foundation of most modern sciences, and really is behind the revolution in science that is still reverberating through the world. In the beginning was the Word. And another way this phrase might be explained is by the central dogma of Francis Crick, the discoverer of DNA. And Francis Crick's central dogma essentially declared that DNA codes can influence and shape proteins through programming ribosomes, but proteins cannot program DNA codes. In other words, the Word informs the flesh and the world, not the material world shaping everything above it, which is the prevailing materialist superstition, which is actually now the chief threat to science in the world. And salient in every science that succeeds is the Word. It comes by many different words: logos, software, code, qubit. That's the word in quantum computing, which I'm a skeptic about quantum computing. It's a new form of analog computing, and analog computing has already been demonstrated not to really work. It imposes all the burden on input-output, and thus loses all the efficiencies it seems to gain by, so it's a misunderstanding of the Word that undermines quantum computing, but in any case, David has been one of the few figures in all the think tank world who understands that C.S. Lewis is a crucial figure in information theory. That an information theory is the fundamental theory that underlies the internet, the computer, all the great achievements of the modern age really derive and are fostered by Claude Shannon and John von Neumann and these figures who were crucial in the launching of information theory. C.S. Lewis's statement of it came in which David wrote an absolutely brilliant essay, the best essay on C.S. Lewis I've ever read, which was called Mere Liberty and the Evil of Statism. or something like that. In any case, it's a masterpiece of an essay expounding the political significance of the works of C.S. Lewis, and it's a marvelous essay that I recommend to you all. But the word underlies is really a hierarchical principle. And in his essay, Transposition, C.S. Lewis showed that imagining a scientist who was trapped in a two-dimensional world, in a two-dimensional landscape painting. And this scientist, you imagine, in this 2D world, would develop perfect theories to explain his experience, perfect 2D explanations of his universe with parallax and the 2D chemistry of the oil, the patterns of the incidence of light, angles of all the various features of his 2D world, he would be able to explain perfectly. And this is the prevailing science of materialism. The prevailing materialist superstition reflects a scientist encapsulated in a 2D world. It's the flat universe theory. And it's even more preposterous than the flat earth theory. And it's more pervasive and more crippling. And as C.S. Lewis showed, you come to this guy trapped in the 2D theory, and you tell him that actually this landscape painting is just a reflection of a vast, multidimensional world beyond it, full of colors and riches and textures and inspired by creativity and full of surprises, and it's just you have this flat Earth, flat universe theory, but he says the scientist would quite confidently answer him. Three dimensions. I have no need for that hypothesis. And as C.S. Lewis wrote, you can't understand a higher medium by studying a lower medium. And this is true across a hierarchical universe. Computer science. No understanding of chemistry and physics can give you the slightest conception of how a computer actually functions, its content, what it's actually accomplishing, what it's doing is incomprehensible through the knowledge of the behavior of every molecule or atom in the computer. It's, as C.S. Lewis says, you can't understand a higher medium by studying a lower medium. It doesn't compute. And human beings really, in economics, I always was like David, I was always amazed that evolutionary theory and other theories deny the existence of God somehow. As Bishop Sheen said, people don't know that God doesn't exist. They don't want him to exist. They certainly don't know. It's a desire to overthrow norms and morals and rules. The low entropy carriers, the the predictable carriers that enable the transmission of information and creativity through the universe. And so this is really the heart of the information theory of economics that I've been developing, which is really springs from this. In the beginning was the Word. And wealth is knowledge, growth is learning, money is time, are the key propositions in the information theory of economics. And you can read about them in Life After Capitalism or any of my recent books. But anyway, this is not a commercial interruption. But ultimately, it's that creativity, as Albert Hirschman of Princeton wrote, creativity always comes as a surprise to us. If it didn't, planning would work, and socialism would prevail. But all creativity is necessarily surprising. Information is unexpected bits, it's surprise. And this concept of surprise leads to a completely different view of economics than prevails in the dominant schools, which reduce human beings to functions of external incentives. And they're all represent an effort to interpret a lower medium without understanding the higher medium. In the beginning was the Word. Human beings are creative in the image of their creator. And David Theroux is a supreme example of this wonderful truth that prevails in a world beyond the flat universe theory. Thank you so much.
The mission of the Independent Institute is to boldly advance peaceful, prosperous, and free societies grounded in a commitment to human worth and dignity. From its start in 1986 as the first garage think tank, Independent has taken on the most important challenges of the day and proposed innovative solutions to seemingly intractable problems. Since its founding, Independent has published over 100 acclaimed and award-winning books. These books have formed the basis for articles, events, and media campaigns.
Over 30 years, we've been privileged to work with really excellent people, including many scholars who've done seminal work in issue after issue. It could be on the environment, or healthcare, or finance, or economics. And we've produced books that have been the bedrock of these different areas, and they have enduring value. It then promotes and inspires other ways of thinking and other people to do more and to look and see what's possible.
In 1987, Independent's future research director, Robert Higgs, wrote what would become a landmark and prescient book, Crisis and Leviathan, which showed how governments use crises and emergencies, both real and imagined, to expand their own powers and limit individual freedom.
A compelling difference with the Institute's program is our understanding that crises are used to grow government. And this awareness led us to see and warn in the aftermath of 9/11 that the terrorist attacks may well be used to grow government in ways that had little or nothing to do with security.
In 1996, Independent launched the Independent Review, the acclaimed quarterly academic journal devoted to an in-depth examination of economics, political science, history, philosophy, and the critical analysis of government policy by some of the world's leading scholars and experts. In the 2000s, Independent established a program advancing solutions for national security while preserving peace and liberty in the aftermath of 9/11. Pioneered enterprise-based approaches to fighting poverty, designed practical, affordable housing policies for America, and expanded its program of market-based solutions to resolve the crisis of healthcare access and cost. Independent's important work continues today with the Millennial Outreach Initiative that builds on its award-winning LoveGov YouTube series, the California Golden Fleece Awards, which spotlight corruption and mismanagement in state and local government, the Beyond Homeless Initiative, which offers solutions to the ever-worsening problems of housing affordability and homelessness, with our open letter critiquing California's politicization of K-12 math instruction, and a focus on building innovative entrepreneurial solutions to today's most pressing problems.
I believe the coming years are going to be pivotal for protecting our freedoms, especially for coming generations. If you want to connect and influence the debate among different types of people, you need to go where they go, and you have to be sensitive to the questions that they have.
Independent presents a forward-looking, optimistic, and solutions-oriented vision. By applying independent thinking to issues that matter, we offer innovative solutions for today's most pressing social and economic challenges. And by connecting these ideas with organizations and networks, we can inspire action capable of unleashing an era of unparalleled human flourishing at home and around the globe. Be part of this movement. Join the Independent Institute now and help us inspire the generations of today and those to come.
And it's my pleasure to now introduce a member of our board of directors, Sarah O'Dowd, who will be our last word.
Good evening. So not only am I last, but I have to follow that. That's a bit hard. So I have been a member of the board of Independent Institute since the end of 1929. I sort of arrived just ahead of the pandemic. Years ago, however, my husband and I had been attracted to Independent Institute because it has twin goals, not only advancing economic liberty, but also advancing human flourishing. And it has a great strategy to achieve those goals by employing nonpartisan, peer-reviewed, world-class scholarship to generate solutions to crucial problems. We knew David and Mary and admired their adherence to liberty and their ability to keep independent, nonpartisan in an increasingly partisan era. All this resonated very much with us, as I'm sure it does with you, and that's why I decided to join the board. So Mary has asked me to speak briefly about the future plans for Independent Institute, and I'm honored to be asked. But first, I would just like to say what a lovely evening this has been, celebrating David's remarkable life. Thank you, Mary and Ben and Paul, for sharing stories and insights about David. I thought I knew him pretty well, but I learned a lot more this evening, and I imagine we all did. I think David would have been particularly happy this evening to hear his longtime friend, George Gilder, share an advanced look at his latest book, which is one in a very long series of magnificent works. But it's serious scholarships by innovative thinkers like George Gilder that has been the hallmark of Independent Institute ever since David first promoted Crisis on Leviathan more than 3 decades ago. The video we just saw does a wonderful job of capturing Independent. In the very beginning, we see David, the entrepreneur, literally in his garage. He was not yet 40 years old when he founded Independent upon the belief that advancing human freedom will advance human flourishing. As all entrepreneurs who found enduring enterprises, David had remarkable vision. He understood not only that pursuing liberty would lead to human flourishing, but also that through serious scholarship, we can identify underlying issues that impinge on our freedom and on our dignity, and unlock transformational solutions. As you likely know, Independent stands unique among liberty-oriented think tanks in insisting on peer review for every book, every journal article, and every policy paper that we publish. Because our work is peer-reviewed and nonpartisan, the scholarship we generate crosses traditional left-right divides, allowing for collaboration across both political and intellectual boundaries. This is more important than ever today. We live in a world dominated by partisan publications, government interference with media outlets, and corrupted academic institutions. As David said in the video we just saw, the coming years are pivotal for protecting our freedoms, especially for coming generations. Our audience of academics, thought leaders, and everyday people is hungry for reliable information and forward-looking solutions. Our mission and vision are perfectly adapted to meeting today's critical needs. David and Mary were working on a plan for next generation leadership when events overtook things with David's untimely passing. As a result, Independent is in a strong position to move forward. We have more than 140 research fellows. We have 7 centers of inquiry. We publish a serious quarterly academic journal, the Independent Review, and we publish dozens of books, policy papers, media articles, podcasts, and other media content, all consistent with David's vision. The entire Independent team responded to the shock of David's passing with renewed vigor and commitment to our vision. Mary and Graham embraced new leadership roles as CEO and president under the most difficult personal circumstances. Center directors, editors, fellows, and staff responded not only with renewed commitment, but with great productivity. Despite the hardships, in 2022, Independent set new records in book awards, media citations, and traditional and social media reach. Our donors, the linchpin of the team, also rose to the occasion. Donations in 2022 set a new record. On behalf of the board, I want to thank our entire team, and especially want to thank those of you who are donors, because carrying on our work would not be possible without your commitment and your generosity. We are frugal and efficient with your donations. This past year, 87% of our operating expenses went directly to programs and publications, only 5% to general and administrative matters. Thank you. David's absence will, of course, be felt going forward. This is inevitable and entirely appropriate. But even unwelcome change seeds opportunity, and we are confident and committed that we can honor David with plans to make Independent even stronger. In that regard, I am excited to tell you about a new position we are establishing here, the David J. Theroux Chair in Political Economy. The Theroux Chair will share many of David's attributes: a significant reputation in the field of economics, the ability to attract and retain a team of talented fellows, authors, and peer reviewers from relevant disciplines, and like David, the generosity to mentor our fellows and advance their careers. This is most of all, the chair must share David's passion for liberty and human flourishing and have the drive to perpetuate our research programs through the decades ahead, consistent with that passion. Our leadership team of Mary, Graham, and the new Theroux Chair will be ideally suited to further our important mission at this time of great political and social challenge. We are in the process of interviewing for the Theroux Chair and are seeing great candidates. We hope that you are as excited as we are about this position and about the future of Independent. As you may not know, David worked for free, and that is one of his attributes that we are unlikely to replicate. Fortunately, donors have already come forward with funding to support the Theroux Chair, but we would welcome your participation. There are envelopes on the table that describe the position and provide an easy way for you to join us, and I sincerely hope you will consider that and do so. As we enter this new year with its many political and social challenges, let's all renew our commitment to Independent's twin goals of human freedom and human flourishing, and move forward with confidence to meet those challenges with transformational solutions based on world-class scholarship and critical thinking. In closing, I wish each of you a happy and healthy new year. Thank you.
We are extraordinarily grateful for everyone in this room. Thank you, Sarah O'Dowd, for summarizing the future.
Carry on. We're here. We have the room until 10, so have fun. Thank you for being here again.